We're back now to look a little more at this energy utilization graph for the United States before we go into the Northwest details. But one thing that's really striking, if you just look at this, is the share of all of our primary energy consumption in 2019 that came from the fossil fuels. Look at that. Coal, 11%. Petroleum, 37%. It's already 48%. And then you add natural gas in, and you're up to what is that? 80% roughly. And by the way, these don't quite add up to 100 because of rounding error. But roughly 80% of our power in the United States, our energy consumption rather, which includes electric power, 80% of it is still fossil fuels. And this is after decades of talking about global climate change. So you could argue we haven't made much progress. And regrettably, that's true. Nonetheless, there's some exciting things that come in with, I misspoke a little bit on the earlier graph. I'm realizing now I look at this. 24% wind, it just means that there's more wind. No, I did not misspeak. Okay, no, more wind than hydro. That's what we said. Okay, we're good there. I did a start there for a minute thinking I misled you. But if you just look at wind and solar here, back to the point, that's a third of all renewable energy. And that's, even a decade ago, I think those numbers were maybe 2 or 3%. So that's a huge change, okay? And we have upped our biofuel production some, although we might talk about that a little later. But that's largely still a very messy story because a lot of fossil fuel energy is actually used to make our biofuels the way our systems work in the United States. We're not really making much progress on climate change emissions on that one. But so these do seem like big gains as a share of total, but they're really a small share overall of the total energy use still, okay? Renewables are only 11%, a small fraction of natural gas, for example. Think of that. Natural gas is almost 3 times as much as all of these others combined, so it's still minuscule. Some people get annoyed when I say that, but really it is minuscule if you think of the total picture, even though in some landscapes you see a lot of that happening, okay? So moving then through to our next look is how the energy system works in the United States overall, and just a little bit, and I'm going to expand this out just a touch. Let's do it that way so that you can see it better. And what is this? Okay, this is a diagram that shows our sources, what we just looked at. Okay, so that looks familiar to you. Okay, should. Okay, and this is what we get in the way of services and goods. Okay, largely services. So what each arrow does is it tells us the share of that total resource going to each end-use sector here. So for example, 70% of all of our petroleum use goes into transportation. And transportation, 91%, this number right here is 91. If you can't see it, maybe some of you are viewing this on a smartphone. I realize not everybody has a big screen computer, but this is 91 here, okay? 91% of all of our transportation energy comes from petroleum products. Mostly that would be gasoline and diesel fuel, okay? So, wow, that's pretty much the only game in town for transportation. Just to look at that a little more, by the way, that's a 3% there. The blue is a 3% if you can't see it. And another 3% of our transportation energy comes from natural gas, and that's mostly from buses and a few fleet trucks around that use natural gas to power them, okay? Another 5% come from renewables, and that's the biofuels, ethanol and biodiesel. So we grow those and then power our cars on what we grew, 5%, okay? That's a big fuel amount, even though 5% doesn't sound like much, okay? And then finally, there is less than 1% comes from the electric power sector, okay? Now that didn't used to have a loop like that. That's a new thing, really, for the most part, where it makes it still less than 1%, although it's getting close. Okay, So natural gas, just a quick look at it, just so we kind of follow it. A big share of that goes for industrial uses, all kinds of petrochemicals, or they're called, or various kinds of chemicals, fertilizer making. A lot of natural gas is used to go into the power sector, so it's used to make electricity, in other words. And in fact, 36% of all the natural gas used goes into the electricity sector. That's a big chunk, okay? There's also the natural gas, a lot of it goes residential, to heat water, to heat, probably you live in a home, if it's a single family residential home in a suburb, it's probably heated with natural gas. So renewable energies, then we talked about those a little bit already. And so over half of all of those, worth remembering, go into, that's 56% right there. Over half of renewable energy goes into making electricity. Okay, so wind and solar and hydro would be the key ones there at this point. Okay, and coal is 90% for electricity, and then about 10% for industrial use, coking coal. Okay, nuclear power is all for electricity, and that then these added up to roughly 100%. I'm not quite sure why we're a little over 100%. That's not an error. There was a reason. I used to know the reason for that. But in any case, what this then tells us is kind of what the sources are for all of the things that we do. So residential, again, a lot of natural gas goes into that sector. Some renewable energy in the form of electricity goes in. But natural gas is the single biggest source, and that's for heating water and heating our homes. And then also natural gas is residential as well, because it goes down here to the electrical sector and then goes up, and it becomes another component of our residential electricity use. Okay, so that's how that all works. Okay. Next slide, Oregon's energy utilization. So what you want to do, and to kind of go over this later, is first click on it and go down to quick facts. Let's do that. And those quick facts are just a little further down right there, the blue. These are worth mentioning just to kind of understand the sector better. If we want to do some analysis of it, we have to understand the basic first. Okay, so 70% of Oregon's utility scale net electricity generation came from conventional hydroelectric power plants and other renewable energy resources. Okay, so about 70% of our power is essentially clean if you're talking about fossil fuels not being used. Okay, so that sounds like a good thing in Oregon. Okay, if you're concerned about climate change. Wind farms produce 12% of our net generation from almost 19,000 turbines with more than 3,200 megawatts of installed generating capacity. Okay, so 12%. Oregon, on the next one, was the nation's second largest producer of hydropower in 2018, accounting for 12% of all of that in the United States. We're also a partner in the West Coast Electric Highway with California, Washington, and British Columbia. Were more than 650 public electric vehicle charging stations with a total of more than 1,500 charging outlets in service across Oregon. Tesla was the first big installer in Oregon. There are other companies doing it as well. Tesla is the automaker, of course. So in the Puget Sound, they refine more than 9/10 of the petroleum products that we use here in Oregon, largely, again, gasoline and diesel. Those come from Washington. Okay. One thing, we may look at how Washington sources those, but two things to know there. Most of that oil or petroleum that comes into Washington refineries comes from Alaska. So the biggest source there on that is Alaska. And then another thing to note is that about 10% of it comes from the oil sands or the tar sands, depending on what you like to call them, up in Alberta. So kind of marginal to the way we define the Pacific Northwest, but we will look at that story a little later. Okay, so we've got that. Let's go down a little farther, and we're going to look at Oregon energy estimates a bit, okay? So by source, so this kind of gives you a sense in Oregon. We look at the national numbers. Remember how big a deal natural gas was? Wow, it's huge here, right? So if you just take all of our total consumption of energy, hydro is the biggest, and it's most of our electricity, okay? And then very close second is natural gas. And as we said, that's a heavy, it's a heating fuel for homes and businesses. And it's also used in petrochemical industry work, although here I think it's mostly for heating in Oregon itself, okay? And we have some biomass, other renewables, which would include wind. That bar will go to zero on the 2021 because they just closed in November of 2020 this month. They just closed the only coal-fired plant we have. So that one will go away. Unfortunately, as that one declines, a lot of that will come from, and it already has, come from natural gas. The coal one used to be bigger over here. So there's a net flow of electricity out of the state. We sell it mostly to California. Okay, we do buy electricity as well, though, and that's mostly in the wintertime. We have lots of hydro in the summer, as you know, in the Columbia system. We've studied that already. Hopefully you caught that little detail. But we send a lot of it to California, and then they'll also send quite a bit of it back to us later in the evening. We sell, especially for their air conditioners. That's kind of a joke, but it's pretty true. Summer, it's a late afternoon peak time that we send a lot of hydro down there. Okay, so that's just a little bit about Oregon's energy utilization. Now let's go back to our outline. And by the way, I won't be able to provide the graph, but you have the link to it in there so you can find it that way. So the next thing we'll look at is a state's overview. And what we're going to do is, it took a minute to load, didn't it? Just a second there. This is a very useful map. And you say, well, it's not a very good map, but they use these. I see these, interestingly, they just showed these for the elections in the United States. There's a map that kind of looks like this because they have those shapes to them, right? We all know that actually Washington and Oregon border each other, but the way these shapes work, it doesn't quite come out, does it? But what I want you to look at is, go back to our questions just for a sec. Look at Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Are we net importers or exporters of energy? Now, what's interesting about that, before we go to the next point, is you did see that we make a lot of hydro and do export some of it, okay? Although we also import some in the Northwest, especially in the state of Washington, from British Columbia. But let's look at, are we importers overall or exporters? Remember, every kind of energy possible. We're talking about electricity, we're talking about natural gas, we're talking about coal, we're talking about oil. So you might even be able to answer this before we go back to that sheet, because you probably know we don't produce any oil or natural gas or coal here, and yet we consume a lot of those first two, at least in the Pacific Northwest. So yeah, so let's go back to that again.